Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to see you all. And thank you for those opening remarks, Gideon, and thank you for the person who mentioned marine natural capital ecosystem, because I am the portfolio director for marine and fisheries in DEFRA, and I got a whoop at the back there. Well done. Thank you. Panel today is going to talk about modern evidence for modern decision making. Really good panel sitting in front of us. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves, and I'm going to ask them to respond to a first question. So introduce yourself and respond to what does modern evidence mean to you. And we'll start with you, Nicol.
Yeah, well, good morning all. My name's Nicol Sinclair. I work with Forest Research. I won't give you my long title, but I'm a classically trained forester. That's my background. In terms of the question, I was struck reflecting this morning out for a walk in Hyde Park. Listening to Radio 4 and they were talking about two things. One was investment in data centres. Another one was investment in the NHS, particularly around technology and in making medical clinical diagnosis of people. And that's where I see the future. We've now got huge amounts of data, terabytes. It's temporal in nature, and it's growing exponentially every year. So we need to store it, we need to analyse it, and then we need tools and models to make sense of it so that we can actually understand how we're going to use all of this information so it just doesn't become noise that sits in a server somewhere. So I think I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Nicol. And Sally?
Hi, everybody. So I'm Sally Bailey, still relatively recent Chief Scientist for Natural England, and dare I admit it, also a forester back in the day as well. So this is not a conspiracy for us taking over. So my response to the question then is we're going to hear a lot about technology and innovation and AI, so I won't touch on that. I think for me, this is about looking at lots of different sources of evidence, not just what we can measure and monitor, but drawing on other sources, drawing on social sciences, drawing on other subjects that we wouldn't have drawn on in the past, and being broad and have a broad church in that respect. Also reflecting on the urgency with which we need this data to make transformational change, I'd say we probably may have to act before we have complete evidence in some cases. So that is being brave and confident to take decisions when sometimes evidence is incomplete, but recognising when the evidence is incomplete, and that's a modern framing of how we use our evidence. But then also, we need to think about how we communicate our modern evidence to make sure that it has impact. So we'll hear a lot today about this evidence having impact. It will only have impact if we think about how we communicate that evidence in the way that policymakers and decision makers and politicians can use the evidence and explore it. So I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Sally. And Grant, hello, good morning.
Yeah, good morning. Yes, so I'm on the marine side, so another flag. This is a forestry sofa. This is maybe the aquatic one. Grant Stenford, Chief Scientist at CFAS. That's an AOB of DEFRA. On this question specifically, I mean, I think someone's mentioned it already that marine has got quite a unique sort of challenge in the fact that we can't see it. We can't see what's below the surface. And I think a lot of what we do in terms of modern evidence is going to be trying to sort of unveil, if you like, that sort of secret world that's down there. So evidence needs data. It needs high quality data. Using those modern methods that Gideon was mentioning, we're increasingly using those to sort of unveil that sort of secret world of eDNA, Earth observations, and automated vehicles, things that can be sent out from the beaches, that kind of thing. It needs to be comprehensive. It needs to cover that sort of natural, economic, societal elements, because again, we see the benefits of that indirect benefit on the shoreline. So we might go to the shoreline to eat seafood or walk on a coast path or whatever. That's how we sort of can value, if you like, what's down there. It needs to be available and open, so we can see data coming in live and being shared much more quickly rather than just held onto and used in certain ways. So sort of live, real time is going to be a thing. We need to have the experts to deliver it, the scientists and so on, that actually can collect it and understand it. That's really important to support that network in the UK. We need to join it together. Systems are really important. We've come to a world where everyone's very, very siloed. Scientists, economists, social scientists are very siloed. And that's where we've got to as a society, not only in the UK but elsewhere. And bringing that together is no small challenge in terms of systems thinking, systems approaches, not being the expert on everything, but answering bigger questions in our own individual fields. And finally, it's got to be useful. It's got to be useful, the evidence we're creating. So in our case, you know, we may be sort of assessing how many fish are in the sea, so we know how many we can catch, but actually we don't really often value that in terms of what that does for society, communities, how healthy it is for people to eat that stuff, rather than other things. So the broader extrapolation of that evidence into, you know, I would call it One Health. It's a different sort of language to this, but that's what we would want to see in that sort of evidence. And my final point very quickly is I think we've got very good at sort of measuring legacy. So our monitoring programs look at what happened somewhere, but I think in the future we're going to be sort of much more looking at what is happening and what may happen. So the sort of philosophical shift into that kind of thinking. Thanks.
Thank you, Grant. Really great. And Rob, morning, last but not least.
Morning. Now I know why I shouldn't have sat at this end of the benches. Everything that they said. Robert Bradburn, I'm the Chief Scientist at the Environment Agency, and contrary to popular belief, I'm not only interested in the water environment, because much as we spend an awful lot of time measuring and trying to understand it, of course, everything that these guys do has an impact on that water environment. It's a great integrator of everything else that's going on around. And that's one of the key parts of the natural capital and ecosystem assessment, I think, that integration. What does modern evidence mean to me? Well, of course, all of the things that have already been said, but I conceptualize it by the difference to me being that modern evidence is evidence that flows in both directions in so many ways. So Grant's just said, it's about being able to look back effectively, but more and more it's also about being able to look forward. When we produce data, gone are the days that someone went out, produced data, someone in government changed that data and published it, and everyone went, thank you, government, for the data. That doesn't happen. That flow of information is both ways. Citizens are out collecting data. They're giving data to us and saying, how can you use our data as well? That flow is two-way. And also, the science that we can do is now a two-way flow with that data, because scientific experiments no longer just produce data as outputs, but they can use that data and data from other places as inputs. So not only can you do hypothesis-driven science, but you can also do data-driven science. So I think modern evidence to me is evidence which enables that flow. It might be a flow in and out of your organization, it might be a flow from past to future, and it might be a flow to and from scientific experiment. And that's where I think this is so exciting.
Great, thank you very much, Rob. So let's stay with your sofa, Rob. And I've got a couple of discussion questions, and then I'm going to throw it open to the floor for some questions. And you should have the Slido link, and if you want to start to put your questions on Slido, if you haven't already, then please feel free to do that. So we'll start with Rob and Grant with there's a bit of a theme developing already about using our data and about using our data in a really, really open way. So can you talk about how far you agree with the Natural Capital Committee and the Dasgupta review that natural capital approaches are an effective way to promote nature recovery and economic growth?
Should we go first?
Okay, far be it from me to disagree with Professor Dasgupta. I'm really delighted that the Treasury asked Professor Dasgupta to do a review and to look at this issue. And I think if you haven't read it, it is really worth a read. It's written in a very clear way. Is natural capital the way forward? Well, I'll just reflect on a conversation I had with the chair of my board at the Environment Agency recently about natural capital. Got to the end of the conversation, and my chair said to me, but, you know, this is like good business sense then, isn't it? That's what you're talking about. Good economic sense. Yes. But people don't do it, do they? People don't make those, quotes, good decisions. because the natural capital might be hidden, it might be out of view, it might not have a value attached to it which that particular business attaches its own value to. There are so many reasons why the obvious doesn't happen. And it becomes obvious when we make it obvious, when we provide that data, when we provide that link through from the facts on the ground, the biodiversity, the habitats, through to value. So I think it is a good way to go, but I think, going back to Sally's point earlier, we're going to have to think of 1,001 ways to communicate it, because going out and telling people that they must manage their natural capital assets better probably is going to work for a tiny, tiny proportion of the world outside of these windows. So yes, I think it's good, but yes, we've got to do a lot of the legwork to make it happen.
Yeah, no, I'd agree with all of that. I think, again, I mentioned about the marine system is the way that people interact with the benefits, if you like, of the capital that's there, natural capital there, is via the things we do. We go to beaches, we go to walk on the coastline, we eat seafood. So I think in some ways it's a sort of bit of a no-brainer that the two things are really intricately linked. But I think, as Rob mentioned, most people don't equate those two things together. So I think that there's a lot to be done there, and just that sort of reminding society generally that this natural system, it's an existential sort of part of our existence, just to remind people that's there. So I think it's a communication piece rather than a intellectual dissection of whether it actually is a good idea. I think for me it's clearly a good idea.
Thank you. I think it goes back to, if we haven't got a world to live in, we don't really need money, do we? So it's actually, where do we start from as well? Okay, Sally, Nicole, thank you for those answers. Let's talk a little bit about innovation. I think, Sally, you mentioned it, and Gideon mentioned the excitement of innovation being explored through the wider programme. So there is increasing demand for evidence as we face more and more threats to the environment. How do you think new technologies such as AI, machine learning, and all of that sort of thing will help to build new insights and enable us to better access environmental evidence? And obviously, Grant, Rob, if you want to chip in as well after this, then please do.
Well, I can lead out. I mean, we've already talked a lot about AI and its benefits that it will have. I think we need to, just be a little bit more specific about what that means. So for in these situations, we're generally talking about machine learning, using the power of big machines to be able to look for those patterns, and particularly for monitoring data, being able to draw out the patterns that we will tell us which direction things are going in. And importantly, we have the ability to collect vast amounts of data. We need to be able to use that to monitor change. So, and be honest also, I would say, about which directions changes are going in, because sometimes we may have unforeseen consequences of policy decisions and what have you. So that's where these vast amounts of data, coupled with machine learning, can enable us to detect these changes early on, so we can use that adaptive policy feedback loop. So we've obviously got AI, we've got eDNA, acoustic monitoring that are all being deployed across the country. And we haven't touched on it just yet, but bringing in citizen science, that's where we can collect a lot of data. We rely on citizens to give us that data, but by applying machine learning in ways of classifying that data, it can become even more useful to programs such as like the NCEA. I think we also need to be aware of the environmental impact of collecting vast amounts of data. That we need to be visible on that, and we need to be respectful and operating in a way that minimises that impact. So obviously there are impacts that MIT have looked into, and the vast terabytes of data that Nicole mentioned do require storage, do require cooling, and therefore environmental impact around that. And so we need to be mindful of those environmental costs. I'll probably leave it there, but I would just like to pick up on the previous question as well, if I may. Because we've already talked about in the future working in the UK in this space. I had a great opportunity to catch up with a colleague from the United States earlier this week, Gretchen Daly, who's over in the UK, and she heads up the Natural Capital project. There's a lot of learning that we can draw on from outside of the UK in terms of how natural capital has worked elsewhere. So I would suggest, opportunity for us to learn from other countries in terms of how they're using their data in their projects. And also in terms of the economic growth piece, which we were talking about, I'd like to mention the Natural England State of Natural Capital report that's actually coming out on the 9th of October. So again, that's taking this data and looking at what that means for the economics of society as well.
Thank you, Sally.
Yeah, well, I'm going to steal a wee bit of thunder from, I'll preface my answer to just a PS to the previous question. I think there was another important publication about 18 months ago, which was the Lords Committee and the Land Use Framework. Britain's a very finite piece of real estate, and if we're going to make decisions, Gideon made the point about how much tree cover there is in England. Well, if you want to move that to 25, 30%, that's going to have to be in somebody else's land, and that really is something we need to get our heads around, how we're going to cope with that, and I think a land use framework would be really very welcome. In terms of the innovation technology front, I guess there's two principal areas I see it evolving. First of all is to the point that the gents were making here about looking forward and how we make decisions about what we're going to do. I think that's going to need really good modelling, really good data, and it's going to need a lot of analysis horsepower for us to run the lever and decide what are the right decisions, because that feeds into the regulatory framework and it feeds into incentives that we are going to be given to folk to do it. The other one is keeping up with what's going on in change detection. So, for example, we are currently working with Forest Services in England trying to identify illegal felling. But in order to identify illegal felling, you have to rule out the legal stuff. So we've got a big project and they're looking to get at least quarterly reports from us. So again, you need a lot of horsepower, a lot of data to be analysed to work that out in different data sources. And you need to understand what data is available and what you can do with it. And again, just to share about the joined up one, if you do tree felling under a Section 75 planning, that doesn't appear in the Forestry Commission's felling licence system. So there's better joined up both at national level, but I would argue in with the council decision making as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then just taking that a step forward, I mean, Sally, you talked about the obstacle of the amount of energy it actually takes to store all this data. But what are the other threats and obstacles to the provision of long-term environmental monitoring? Just opening back up to everybody. So, Sally, do you want to start?
Yeah, I think the biggest challenge, particularly for government-funded projects, is the certainty around funding, of course, and the longevity of the funding programmes. We are, of course, in a difficult funding cycle at the moment, and that's evident across all governments. So it's thinking quicker and smarter about how we can ensure that there is longevity of funding streams to ensure that this work can continue, because without that and the resource, we are going to be challenged. Again, looking beyond UK shores, there are smarter ways to fund as well, collaborations and accessing private funding as well.
I think I completely agree on the funding. That's always going to be an issue. But I think also there's an issue about the push and pull of long-term data. I'm sure many of us in the room spend our lives making business cases to say that, this is a good thing to do. When you make a business case, you kind of have to set out what you're trying to do and what you're trying to achieve. Now, you can do that for some data, and a lot of the data the Environment Agency collects is for a very specific reason. But some of the value, and maybe a lot of the value, in the data that something like the NCEA is collecting is that we don't know how valuable it's going to be. That's a really hard argument to make. I can make the argument when I look back at data sets that go back for the last 20 years and go, wow, look what I've now managed to extract because I've got the bigger computer and I've been able to iron out all the wrinkles in it, and I can see a change that I wasn't expecting and is going to challenge me to think about how I manage the environment. That's really valuable. But those data weren't collected for that reason. That was never in the business case. But it could be fundamentally useful. So I think there's a real challenge with the long-term data of saying we are going to need to collect data which we can use now and that we know that people like you are desperately looking for. But we've also got to bear in mind that someone in the future is going to look back at that data and potentially find an even greater use for it. So how do we structure it in a way that enables it to allow that innovation in future?
I think that, bringing that innovation, that long-termism together is quite important because the projects are just not funded in that way, but the issues are big. Projects are small, issues are big. So I think that needs to shift around. But I mean, that point you made, Robert, I think the key bit there is, when you're collecting data for anything, the real value of AI and these sort of big data is, I think it's going to be in sort of proxies in the future where you say, the data wasn't collected for this reason, but it does turn out that the presence of ABC relates to X, Y, Z, and no one even thought about asking that question 20 years ago, but now we know that those things are related. So there's a much easier way of monitoring that thing by measuring this much easier proxy. That's we already see that in my sort of traditional field of animal health, where you might be looking for a certain viral infection in an animal, but it may be the presence of 3 bacteria in the soil are telling you of that presence easier than it is looking for the thing itself. So that's what I mean about proxies. There could be all sorts of proxies in the data we collect that are going to be very useful for modernising future evidence.
Excellent, thank you, Grant. Nicole, did you want to come in and then I'm going to open it up for questions?
No, but I would just echo the point of proxies. I think that's a very, very good one. We've been talking about for soils, because above the ground vegetation can be a very good proxy for what's going on under the ground. So I think you're absolutely right.
Okay, let's turn to the audience and look for any questions. I've got a few that have come up on Slido. So while you're thinking about being brave enough to put your hand up, I'll ask you a question from Slido. Need my glasses. Our first question from Slido, how should all the outputs from the NCA be brought together in order to ensure a natural capital approach is implemented into decision making? Rob.
Well, I'll start. I've got a big grin on my face because I love systems maps. And one of the pieces of the work that we're doing under the NCEA is actually to try to conceptualize the whole system that is impacting that thing that we call the water environment. And it's been really exciting to see that develop and to see, going back to the proxy point, the sorts of things you can measure versus the sorts of things you can't measure. But if you can get it right and placed within a system, then actually you can see that if the flow of something is coming through this way, as long as you catch it somewhere along that point, you don't necessarily have to measure all of those things. And that's really important as well, because none of the things that we are trying to do in the water environment, certainly, and I'm sure in some of the other aspects of the environment, are going to be solved by silver bullets. We're going to have to see change at various parts of the system to deliver those benefits. So that's where that real issue of bringing the data together comes from. I'm just as interested in what's happening in the soils, how many trees there are, where the biodiversity is, and what's happening out at sea, as I am in what's happening in that particular part of the river. So working out a way for us all to share our data, not to get hung up because we're all different sorts of public bodies, to be able to analyse that data and put it out in a way that's actually useful to people outside, because, trust me, the raw data that's coming out on the water environment is useful to very few people. It needs to have some sort of analysis. Those are the real challenges. So we've got to remember we've got to invest in those systems, not just the collecting the data, so the systems need to be in place to enable us to use it.
Thanks, Rob. Sally?
Yeah, I mean, all that Rob said, of course, but another way to think about this is to look at the other end of the telescope and think about, well, what are those big policy questions that are coming up that we can then develop and build on those systems approaches, but aim the outputs and the learning at the big policy questions. So again, that is where we work very closely with our policymakers and our ministers, and also what we're hearing from our wider stakeholder groups about the big burning questions, we know what they are, but it's making sure that we are aiming this big data, this fantastic resource we're working at, using these approaches specifically at the questions.
I was thinking of that question, mulling it over, and I think back to my operational days. I was involved in the late noughties in Scotland in a lot of woodland creation projects, and I was dealing with people who had been involved in the 80s, and then they just were going to create a woodland and they'd go and do it, whereas I had to educate them. It took 2 years from buying a piece of ground to go through all the processes to actually be able to do something on the ground. I would hope this approach would streamline that planning framework and allow, as the late Tiziano, who was in charge of the title production system, said just before he died what he was working on, he says, I'm trying to shorten the time between the customer placing the order and getting the money out of their pocket. And I would hope that a more systems approach would allow things to happen faster.
Any questions? We've got some roving mics if anybody wants to ask a question. Okay, well, I'll go. Oh, we've got one over there. Rohan. Ro, do you want to stand up?
Thank you very much. Ro Allen from DEFRA's Marine and Fisheries Directorate. So my question is, how important do you think seamless data integration between organisations is for enabling modern evidence and modern decision making?
Thank you. Grant, do you want to start?
I think that's really important. You know, I guess if you had to do a blank sheet of this, how would you do it? Would probably not be the way we're working. I think there's two options. I think that if you had to do it from a blank sheet, you would do it differently. You would do it in the way that probably Ro's proposing. But if you haven't got that, then you've got to come up with some really, really good way of engineering data. So when you collect it in whatever form that is, and bearing in mind, you know, data is everything from sort of photographs and videos. People have taken soundscapes, you know, genomic data, chemical profiles, whatever you might be talking about. Just because we've collected it doesn't necessarily mean it's useful for anybody at that point of collection. So organisations like our own, I think, have got to invest in the sort of data engineers, if you like, that sort of translate that data into usable stuff that's then lodged somewhere centrally, and then it becomes a sort of a discussion about sharing. So I think that it's really important, but most nations don't have the ability to blank sheet things. They have to work with the structure they've got, so sharing structures are probably quite important.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor?
Thanks. Obviously, there's a big focus on data and technology and integration, but is there a danger that we over-focus on that and forget about the ways of working, the collaboration and integration with other partners across society? My experience is that you can create brilliant data solutions, but if you don't fix the people networks, they won't use them.
Good question. Sally, shall we start with you?
Well, I wholeheartedly agree. This isn't just about government and ALBs working together. This is also bringing in wider society, academics and other institutions into this space. And so I don't want to get above my pay grade, but, you know, being able to share data beyond government is also critical in this, and also bringing other experts into the discussions as well, because we don't just want to be talking to ourselves about this. We want to hear from academics, experts, and practitioners as well. So I would wholeheartedly agree we should be operating within the broad church here.
Thank you. Nick?
Yeah, again, I would agree, and one of the reasons I'm so keen on a strategic spatial land use framework, that you can start to have these discussions with communities about where you think certain things that you want to happen are going to happen. Whether that's onshore wind farms, whether it's road building, whether it's forestry expansion, new woodland creation, somebody somewhere has got to lay out how and where that's going to happen, and that's going to affect communities, and they've got to have a choice about that. I mean, again, my experience in the past with this, little things can really upset a community, and when you actually hear what they've got to say, little things can really sort the problem out quite quickly. So I think getting the relationships right as well, but we need something to talk to about what it is that we're going to do. And at the moment, there's too many competing, is it food security, is it, wilderness expansion, is it onshore wind farms? They all take up space, and we need to have conversations, honest conversations about where that's likely to happen.
And I would just add that I think you're right, culture and people are really important to this. And it's certainly a reflection that I've had working with the many people across the agency who are collecting all of this data for us. It's really, really important to have rapid feedback mechanisms. You can't go out and ask a bunch of citizen scientists to do some data collection for you and then never tell them where the data went. They won't do it again. You need to have the conversation with the experts about the sorts of things that they might be using that data for. Because we are all human, and I know that there are some processes that get left to a Friday afternoon, and oh gosh, I've got to fill out this flipping Excel spreadsheet again telling me where I went this week and why do I do it, and approximately right's okay. If you get that sort of attitude because you don't know how valuable the thing that you are doing is, then the data itself becomes poorer. So we want citizen scientists to be producing data that we can really use well, but that requires two-way conversations, and that requires a culture of people understanding that this data is really valuable, not just to them, but will be even more valuable and have more impact if it's used more broadly. So I think we've got to keep having those conversations at community level with citizens, but also with our own people, to help them to understand just how important it is to do that really well.
So I'm going to take another question from Slido, and then I've got a question down at the front here. So while the mic is making its way, staying on that community theme, there's a question here about local authorities. A lot of natural capital is managed by local authorities. Is there more that could be done to support them to collect, understand, and be accountable for funding decisions? Ooh. Good question, whoever's that one.
Well, I'll maybe get the ball rolling. All delivery is local. It's beside somebody's house, beside somebody's community. Whatever it is, it's going to have a local theme to it. I think the difficulty has been what we've talked about, a lack of joined up approach across the regulatory framework, both horizontally and vertically. And I think that could definitely do with tidied up, but that's maybe a motherhood and apple pie discussion for another day. But yeah, I personally think getting engagement, decision-making closer to where the delivery is going to happen can only be a good thing. And it will take a lot of anger, tension, and resentment out of the conversation. I was struck, there's a big conversation going on in Wales at the moment about wind farms, onshore wind farms, and the infrastructure required to get that onto the grid. And that debate has moved from we don't want it to whether it should be overland or underground. And now they're starting to talk about the dangers, ecologically could be worse by putting it underground. So sometimes you have to put that investment and explain to people why things are going to be the way they're going to be, but they're best happening at a local level. And I'm not necessarily sure that it's always local authorities, but people who are responsible for enabling these things at a local level have to be empowered to work with the communities and where that's going to happen, would be my reflection, my experience of dealing with that kind of thing.
Yeah, and I would go further than local authorities. And I think it's something that the whole NCA programme is going to have to think about very hard over the next few years, is this linking to the people who are benefiting from the outputs of the programme better. And being able to have the conversations about whether they are already collecting some of the data that we could use, because you discover that businesses, local authorities, others are collecting data on things like soils. They just don't realise they are, and often those data will sit in a cupboard somewhere because they were done for a planning application or an investigation or something. They could be useful. So can we unlock some of those things that are already happening? And also, by showing the value of the data, can we tempt some of these people into saying, actually, I want more of that in my area, and I'm willing to put in a bit, and I'm willing to contribute my people, my time, my money, whatever, because actually I can see how valuable it would be to have that at a level of granularity higher in my area, and so I'm willing to play in. That would be a fantastic thing. That's why I think it's great to have today as an early start to start engaging with potential users of the data, to start saying, what's exciting? What do you want to do more of? What do you want to see more of? So we can start to have those conversations. But I think it goes beyond local authorities. I know they control an awful lot of land and natural capital assets, but I think so do an awful lot of other people who could be engaged.
That's right. Nicole, you want to come back in?
Just very briefly, already one of the outputs from TNCA, the Trees Outside Woodland Map, we've sent it to community groups in Cumbria. It's been used by the scientists looking at the White Rose Forest, and we've got a lot of interest from local authorities who are doing their local nature recovery strategies. So we're trying to make it as available and help them where we can to understand how to use that. But already a range of different groups are using that data to make local decisions, whether it's a strategic plan and local nature recovery strategies, or a community group that's wanting to plant some trees for. So I think we should just be alive to the fact that different perspectives will utilise the data. But yeah, I think we've made the point. I think there's lots of local delivery groups will be involved.
Absolutely, and you've all talked a little bit about citizen science as well, and I think that community link as citizens really, really important. And just throwing it out there, civil servants or public servants have volunteering days. Send them out to do some citizen science. I'd love to do that. That'd be great. All right. So promise I'm not abusing my position as chair. There's a very interesting question here that says, do we have vast amounts of data? In marine environment, we have very little monitoring around the UK. How can we use the growth of the marine industry, so offshore wind, et cetera, to actually drive forward real proper data collection? Is there an opportunity for us here?
Yes, there is, and a big opportunity. I mean, there's a lot of structure out there for a start. Going in, wind farms are a good example, where, with the sort of evolution of modern automated vehicles, sensors, and so on, where those structures can absolutely be used for collecting data that contributes to the decision making around those areas. So those kind of conversations between sort of public, private are there to be had increasingly as the space becomes more used. And it's hard putting things out in the sea as well. They get fouled up with all sorts of things. So having people maintaining them on your behalf, that kind of thing, is extremely useful. And we're talking a lot about how to also sort of adapt our own marine monitoring. So we can, we have a large research vessel in the UK called the Endeavour that goes out there and collects data. But increasingly, you've got things you can launch off the side, off beaches, and whatever else. And also, go back to the citizen science a little bit as well, is to not be too sort of elitist about the data as well, because I think there's scientists think they've got the better data, but there's a lot of people out there observing on our behalf. And I think to make use of that, especially on mass, can create quality out of volume. So just to use the people as well as the industry. Yeah.
Really good question. I have a question down here at the front. Oh, you've got a mic and everything.
Yes.
Hello?
Yep.
Lucy Lyons, Marine NCA Programme Director. Going back a few questions to the bit around cultural change, do you think in NCA we're doing enough beyond data to address breaking down those silos to work in a system, whether that's land to sea and the interface between those two, or we're talking about earlier the UK system rather than just England? And if we're not, what more could we do in the future?
Breaking down silos. Sally.
Well, having just come from north of the border to work south of the border, I would wholeheartedly agree with that. The science and the evidence is the same, and we need to draw on the same science, whichever country or devolved administration we're in. So I think there's a lot more we can do, and I think we're seeing a signalling from ministers of all the devolved administrations and UK government now that the relationships are maturing as well. So I think there's great opportunity there. We also can look to our research funders. So obviously UKRI operates on the UK level, and a lot of other related projects such as LUNs, etc., also operating at the UK level. So I think there's a lot, there's really good green shoots there. There's a lot to build upon, but absolutely we need to be ensuring that we are collaborating going forwards, we'll be using the same science, but where we can start to develop data sets that are spanning the UK, then that data becomes even more powerful to detect those changes. Because as we know, nature doesn't respect administrative borders.
Nicole.
Yeah, well, I'm in a fairly privileged position. I still, in a federated organisation, so we still have interest in Scotland and Wales, and I've certainly been briefing colleagues, and they've been funding similar products that have been developed under the NCA, particularly in Scotland. I think NCA has started on the right foot. I think it could do more. I really enjoy working with colleagues across the other disciplines, if I could describe it as that. But I think there's an obvious next step, which is get some of that data integrated more strategically so that we can have healthy cross-discipline discussions about how we're going to support different kind of developments, whether it's construction, whether it's green infrastructure, it doesn't really matter. I think that will be what particularly the private sector we're looking at is, can you make it easier for us to do things? And does it mean I have to go and speak to 4 different folk in order to get a decision? I think that goes back to what I'm saying, try and make it more seamless, and I think there's an opportunity here and we should grasp it. So to your answer, I think it's started on the right track, but there's always more things that we could do to do better.
Yeah, and absolutely picking up on Nicole's last point, I'm old enough to remember the white paper of 2011 that started talking about how we must be more systematic in our approach to the environment, and had a lovely graphic showing how the environment was a joined up system, and thinking, what I do to the rivers impacts what Grantland has to do in the seas, etc., etc. But what I have learned over the following decade is just telling people that they should get out of their silos and stop just thinking about their day job. And you really must think about the big picture and don't just do what you're doing. That's really hard, because we've all got day jobs to do, and we do have our own individual objectives. So I think recognizing that if we feel that there is a strong enough case that we should be taking a more joined up approach to something to deliver an output because it requires that, then we will have to do a lot of the legwork to show just how easy we can make it to take those other things into account. Because just expecting people to do it and saying, wasn't a good decision, it wasn't very joined up, never wins you any friends. We've got to put in a lot of the legwork, and there's a lot of people in this room who have the ability to help others to do that. And that's a really positive thing that this programme can do.
Thank you, Rob. And Grant.
Just very quickly, I think some of the points about culture and some of those join up is really important. I mean, you could structure a new program around our food, our water, our environment. You don't have to have a sort of terrestrial and marine or terrestrial, because that naturally creates. I mean, the danger is whatever you sort of structure you have, you create another silo. That's the danger. But I think it's about having common language. I mean, if you want to bring everybody in, everybody gets our food, everyone gets our recreation, our water, whatever. So I think it's about structuring these things so the why bit is really sort of brought out, rather than sort of the process of how we're going to join up. That's kind of slightly off-putting to many people where they don't really get, they're sort of excluded from that. But whereas if we talk about how we're going to get our food from the UK, and we're going to use this approach to do that, suddenly everyone in the room is able to talk about that, because we're all going to go and eat some food today. So I think it's about trying to find some common ground and structuring these programs maybe around that.
Make it real for people.
Make it real.
Really, really important. Okay, I've got one final question for all of the panel. And Rob, you went last time, so I'll start with you this time. So the 30-second version. What one change should we be making right now to better enable modern evidence to inform modern decision making?
I wish it started at the other end. One change. is just to remember, and I'm going to get the quote wrong, that science is 99% perspiration and 1% inspiration. There's a lot of groundwork. There's a lot of people doing a lot of stuff behind the scenes. The environment is very, very, very big and very fractal, and you need to understand it at lots of different scales. So don't let anyone fool you that taking 3 measurements and you're done is the answer. You need to put in the legwork, you need to put in the groundwork, then you can do the exciting stuff for that 1% of inspiration.
Thank you, Rob. And Grant?
Yeah, I've mentioned it a few times. I mean, the link between land and sea for us is absolutely fundamental. We're going to need to use the sea increasingly as it industrialises over the next 50 years. There's a lot of sea out there, 3 times the size of the land mass and all that kind of thing. So we need to understand what we're doing on the land that affects our use of the sea. Our food systems, we poison the water, we can't put take food out of that, it'll come back to us. So that link up and sort of structuring programs like this around tangible outcomes and whys, I think will revolutionise the way we look at data and collect it and use it.
Thank you. Sally?
I think we need to act with a sense of urgent ambition. We need to, and within that, I think we need to, that ambition needs to be this more collective working that we've heard a lot about today. But I'm concerned that we are having a really interesting and stimulating discussion today. Have we got the urgency that we need to really tackle some of these issues that are starting to erode our natural capital?
Thank you.
Well, my view, don't throw babies out with bathwater. There's a lot of good people, very smart folk. My view would be join them up better. And I think I would expand on the point you were making, talk about land use in its general terms, what we're going to do. I've mentioned the land use framework. I still think that's got to be on the table. Then we can have conversations about food security, energy security, carbon capture in a far more healthy way than the slightly full competitive nature that it happens at the moment.
Thank you, Nicole. Thank you, everybody, for your questions. We're going to wrap up our panel now. I think we should be going forward with urgent ambition and making decisions even when the evidence isn't absolutely perfect. Everybody can see the Slido questions. There's some fantastic questions on here. I've not been able to do justice to the number, but hopefully I could have picked out a representative lot. But do have a look at the Slido questions. And now will you join me in thanking the panel?